Leg Party by J. Wilburn. Hudson passed the thickest of the trees along the pine straw covered road. He had missed the turn for the column of smoke he was tracking, so he doubled back. This time he located the gate to what was probably a neighborhood not too many years ago. It wasn't like a real fortress gate, but just decorative. Poison ivy vines rendered it nearly invisible. It had been a nice neighborhood, lots of wooded acres around every abandoned and decaying house, each house like a cabin, each house um, each house designed like a cabin but as big as mansions. The smoke rose from the top of the hill. Hudson cut his eyes from side to side. There weren't many people left in the world, but he still didn't want to take the chance of getting caught off guard by any other survivors. This should have been safe in theory. Smoke columns communicated a particular set of expectations. Not exactly friendly, but not purely hostile either. All right. The strange custom had become to leave any extra cooked food on plates out at the edge of your camp. It said, "We're friendly enough to share what we can, but you're not invited any closer." Hudson made the next rise and saw the end of the street in a sloppy twist of bushes and unswept road. The fire was around here. Hudson had taken a few meals this way. He was no hunter and could barely start a fire, so fresh cooked meat was quite a treat. He occasionally started his own fires and left a plate out, but never had a visitor. He ended up eating his extras himself. Let's say alone. I think the fact that he's been alone a long time is pretty significant to this story, so we're going to emphasize that. As the last driveway came into view, he saw a girl about his age standing at the head of that drive. And another decorative gate. Let's say at another decorative gate, an open gate. He stopped short. Running into people on the road was so rare as to be terrifying. She was a little shorter than him. She wore jeans and a pullover jacket of some kind. She had no pack. She looked clean, and that seemed weird to Hudson. The lack of dirt on her skin and in her hair made her glow like an angel to him. And it was terrifying. All right. Continuing on here. Hudson had never had a fight with anyone before or after the plague years, but his hands touched the gun in one pocket of his pack and then the knife on his hip before dropping back to his sides. He folded and unfolded his arms several times. What the hell did he do with his arms back when he saw people all the time? She turned her eyes to him, and he felt a deep cold wash down through his body into his tingling fingers and toes. She didn't look the least bit scared or surprised to see him. That somehow scared him even more. How far up could he wind himself before something popped in his head? All right. Continuing on here. She said, "You can go ahead of me. I need another minute, maybe." He knew all the words she used, but they made no sense to him. What? His voice croaked out the sound of the word like a neglected instrument. She tilted her head and smiled. Warmth replaced the cold and felt terribly hot by comparison. "I know it sounds silly, especially after being here for several days, but I'm still new here and don't quite feel at home yet." Hudson tried to explain himself, but all he could produce in the way of language was another what? He cleared his throat, and it sounded like rolling gravel. Alright, that's good. Well, I think it's good. I mean, I'm writing the story. What do I know? Alright, she squinted and shook her head. Hudson flashed back to the awkward days of high school that were never to return. I'm Lily. I only got here a few days ago. Hell, it might have been a week by now, but it still feels strange to me to be around so many people. And now we're having this party. Okay, words, Hudson thought. Use some words like in the old days. I just got here. I don't know what. Lily's eyes got wide and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. This must be confusing as hell. Do you want to come with me and I can introduce you to everyone?" Everyone. Well, everyone isn't here right now, but they will be as the party really gets going. Hudson located the column of smoke, let's say in the sky. In the sky over the trees, and then attuned to Lily's face again. Party? Yeah, Mr. Hemingway thought it would be a good way for everybody to bond now that so many of us are together. Mr. Hemingway, he owns the house. He's the only old man I've seen since everything fell apart in the last wave of sickness. He may not be that old, but compared to everyone else. Alright, let me change this to a real ellipsis. There we go. Alright, right, Hudson said. He was proud of how very normal that word sounded and felt off his tongue. Come on, I'll show you. Lily held out a hand and Hudson shuffled toward her. His hands had the mad urge to go to his weapons again, but he reached for her hand instead. She turned and walked through the gate before he could take her hand. Maybe holding hands wasn't what that gesture meant. Maybe that was just a come along kind of wave. Hudson honestly couldn't remember from before. He walked beside her on the left and about a half step behind. She had to turn her head to address him as they walked up the winding path together. Where were you before? He had to think before he could answer. Before I came up the road? Before everyone died, she said. He swallowed a couple times and tried to remember where he put his canteen. I was over in Rockdale. Rockdale. Her eyes sort of crossed and she looked up into the trees instead of at him. Like 100 miles west of here? I'm going to put a question mark there because that sounds like a question to me. Alright, Hudson looked up and this needs to be an at, I think. Hudson looked up at clear blue sky between the thicker branches as if that would help. I don't know. I think I've been going in circles for a long time. Like Moses, she said. What? Never mind. What high school did you go to? He paused again. Davenport. Bulldogs? What? Your school mascot. Were you Bulldogs? No, Blue Devils. Okay. That seemed to be it as the cabin-like mansion came into view. It had a wide turnaround that seemed well kept. A number of cars and bikes were parked along the pavement and up onto the patchy grass. And I want to describe the house a little more. This cabin mansion had a number of wings that spoked off from the main body of the house. Okay. None of that detail stuck with him as Hudson stopped in place. Even in the afternoon daylight, he could see electric lights through the windows. He felt sort of dizzy and out of time, like dreaming awake. Do you need a minute? Lights, he said. For a couple seconds, he wasn't sure he used the right word. Oh, right, Lily slapped her forehead. I guess I'm more used to this than I thought. Yeah, Mr. Hemingway hooked up generators and green energy stuff. There are other lights around the spillover houses along the lake. It was kind of hard to hear her over all the geese. Spillover lake. Yes, we have quite a gathering of new friends, maybe the start of a new civilization. and we're on the lake. Come on. Hand out again. He didn't try to take it this time, but followed her. Some of the geese started laughing. Hudson was already following her through the front door. Oh, I already said follow here. Let me say trailing. He was already trailing her through the front door when he realized the geese were people talking. A huge crowd of people. Hudson held on to the fine wood of the foyer as he stared at the most people he had seen since I left my mom at the hospital. He finished the thought out loud. You'll have to speak up now, Hudson. It was like she was yelling at him, and his gut filled with watery fear. It's a party after all. All right. This time she did take his hand and led him forward. Holding Lily's warm hand in his clammy one made him feel weaker instead of comforted. People bumped into him as they weaved through the crowd. One guy stepped on Hudson's foot. Another elbowed him in the spine as that guy was laughing. Laughing so loud it sounded like a howl to Hudson. All right, that's good. They got into a bit of a clearing between the kitchen and the large living room area. She dropped his hand and he missed her touch immediately. She yelled at him, "Are you hungry?" "What? I mean, yes," he yelled back. She swept her hand along the entire back wall. Tables upon tables of cooked food spread as far as he could see. He wandered away from her in shock. So much, too much to be real. Hudson reached out with one shaking palm and felt the warmth rising off the trays. Bacon? Bacon-wrapped food. Where did the bacon come from? All right. I'm going to add another question mark here in this train of thought we got going. Hudson wasn't a savage. He remembered bacon came from pigs, of course, but what pigs supplied this bacon? All right, that needs to be a question mark. Getting really stingy with the question marks in my first drafts. He popped one bacon-wrapped something into his mouth and had to hold on to the edge of the table to stay on his feet. It was some kind of meat, but he couldn't tell what. It was just savory heaven. Maybe some other pork. Pig-wrapped pig, Hudson mumbled over the mouthful. He started to giggle and then couldn't stop. He coughed and choked, but refused. Let me take out the then. Just a moment. I'm starting to cough and choke on my own words. Pardon me. He coughed and choked, but refused to lose the food. He swallowed it down and then popped another and another. It wasn't all the same bacon-wrapped stuff. Was that a scallop? Couldn't have been. The next one might have been a bacon-wrapped Brussels sprout. He hated Brussels sprouts, but then swallowed 3 more whole. His mother would be proud, the mother he left to bleed to death alone and sick in an overrun hospital. He started coughing again, even as he shoved more food in his mouth. A hand patted his back and offered a mug of something to drink around his side. Hudson gulped it down. It was cold, and the shock of cold liquid for the first time in forever stopped his choking. Then the flavor hit, and he thought it was cold urine for a split second. He almost spit it out across the buffet, but then his distant memory identified beer. It was cold beer. He felt a stupid grin spread across his entire face. He turned around to face 2 young men, a little older than him and cleaner. The smile dropped, and he had a second where he thought he should hit them or bite them. "Hudson," Lily said. She was still here. He drew close to her as he kept his eyes on the 2 guys still smiling at him. All the moving bodies throughout the house added to this near hysteria. Hudson had an image in his head of writhing snakes, and his skin crawled. Okay. He thought he was breaking out in a cold sweat, but then realized the vent above his head was blowing cold air. Air conditioning, he whispered. Both guys laughed. One of them held up a fist and said, "Fucking A." Lily introduced the one who spoke first as Evan. The other was Kent. They held out hands and Hudson started to back away, but then remembered shaking hands. He did his best to mimic the old tradition. There was a time when touching hands was an invitation to get sick. That uneasy fear lingered in Hudson as he wiped off his hand on his pants. Let's make it gritty. Hudson has not had a bath recently, so we're going to make his clothes gritty. All right. Continuing on here, Lily says you went to Davenport, Kent said. Hudson had to pull up the name in his mind again. Yes. I think we played you in football, Evan said, at least in one playoff game. Hudson nodded. I think I might have seen you, Kent said. Were you in theater? What theater? Oh, theater classes. Yes. Did you do the one acts that last year before the lockdowns? One act play competition. Hudson tried the words out, and they seemed to make sense. Let's say they seem to make sense in their own alien way. Yes. Crazy, Kent said. You never find anyone you really know anymore. Glad you're here. Hudson didn't feel like they really knew each other at all, but he nodded and forced a smile. It was starting to feel like high school again. If the world hadn't ended, he'd be in college now, Hudson calculated in his head. All right, let me add on. He couldn't figure out why that fact would matter. All right, I'm going to add something in here. Who was the last person to speak? It was Kent. All right. Evan asked, did you get vaccinated before everything went to hell? Went to hell, I mean. Hudson shook his head and worried this might be the end of his invitation to bacon wrapped heaven. All right, let's have him say something about this. I was too young back then. We all were. Evan. I spelled his name even up here. Let me fix that. Don't need to add mistakes into the story. That's not the point of editing. All right, we all were, Evan said. Yet we're the ones still alive. Except Mr. Hemingway. He got one shot before the end. For whatever that was worth. All right. As I'm writing this, I don't want it to sound like it's a statement on current events. I know it's hard to do that when you're writing a plague story during a pandemic, but I kind of wanted to treat this as something independent of what's going on here. So everyone that survived this is surviving something different than what we went through. But I guess there's no avoiding parallels, right? All right. Where is he? Hudson asked. Another girl walked up before anyone could answer. Kent said, "This is Sadie. She went to Whittemore." That meant nothing to Hudson, but he said, "Oh, cool." He lifted the beer in her direction and took a deep swallow. Evan said, "Hudson literally just got here. Can you imagine?" "We all just got here at some point," she said. They turned, and Hudson was shoveling food into his mouth again. "Help yourself," Kent laughed. Lily put a hand Lily pulled at Hudson's shoulder and said, "You have to be careful. If you haven't eaten in a while, your brain doesn't remember how to tell your body to stop." Hudson swallowed and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Oh, okay, thank you." He looked longingly at the food everyone else seemed to just be picking at. She took his empty mug and said, "How about a cold water?" He accepted, and they walked out on the back deck. It was a mild day, but they had a fire pit going in the middle distance of a cobbled section of the yard. Mowed grass sloped down to the lake, which reflected bright sun in mad sparkles. Hudson missed the air conditioning immediately. All right, now I have her walk off without him at some point here, like right here. But I think there needs to be more conversation going on. "How did you do it?" she asked. Okay, let's have him do what? Every time he said this word, he felt dumber. It was like being a barking dog instead of a person having a conversation with a lovely young woman. "How did you survive? Did you know how to hunt?" Hudson snorted at that, and it hurt his sinuses. All right. He took a swallow of the cold water, but it barely helped. I mostly canned goods and moving from house to house. She nodded and sighed. It was scary, but I slept in a tent everywhere I went. I was afraid to go into houses because of all the bodies. Unless it was really cold, then I'd try to find an empty house. Did you sleep on the beds? Hudson asked. She tilted her head at him, and he felt stupid again. I just mean, I always slept on couches, she said. Even with the beds empty, it felt weird. He sighed and blinked away the start of tears. Me too. Oh, that's not a comma. Me too. Yeah. Me too. Always on couches, never on the beds. She patted his shoulder and said, "We can probably find you a bed or comfortable couch for tonight after everything is over." He swallowed a couple times and nodded, but thought of no words to go along with his agreement. Alright, I think we got that. Let's move forward here. I have to set up a few things. Will you be okay on your own for a little while? She asked. He stared at Lily and swallowed a couple more times, let's say. Sure. His voice hardly shook at all, but as he watched her go, he was certain he'd never see her again. Hudson drank down the water that he didn't remember picking up. Kent, Evan, Sadie, and a half-dozen others passed him on their way outside. Someone he didn't know asked him, "Are you going to wear that backpack forever?" Why would he put it down? It had all his survival gear. No one else was wearing packs or stowing weapons. He supposed that did look weird. Finally, he said, I might take it off later. Let me have him stutter here. I might take it off later. Alright, there we go. The group was already gone by then. He stood around outside a while and then went back inside, where he ate his way up and down the tables. He kept eating long after he knew he was full, but finally tore himself away. He fell into an empty leather chair under a cold vent and sat there for hours. His backpack okay. He still wore his pack bunched between his sweaty back and the leather of the chair. Alright, I'll need to make the next one a new paragraph. There we go. People stopped, introduced themselves, spoke of their past, welcomed him, offered him drinks that he took, and moved on. He retained none of their names and could hardly recall their faces. Such mental skills were rusty for him. One girl sat for a long time and told him a meandering story about how she got out of the city alone. He could not remember her name or what city. She finally moved on. She was friendly and pretty, but she wasn't Lily. He couldn't figure out why that would matter to him, but it did. Okay. I think we can crash towards the end here. His stomach gurgled and he jumped up to go outside to take care of it. There were people everywhere and he started to panic. How did people handle bathroom emergencies back when there were people standing around everywhere? Bathrooms. The answer was right there in the question. If Mr. Hemingway's house had electric lights, cold beer, and bacon-wrapped everything, he likely had working bathrooms. Like from before the plague. Bathroom, Hudson called out to the closest group. They just stared at first. Was it not polite to use that word? Then, let's say, most of them pointed down a hallway beyond the kitchen. A couple others pointed in different directions back through the crowd. He followed the directions of the majority. Okay, let's say he found it, closed the door, and parked himself there for a long time, much like the leather chair. He managed not to throw up as he sat on the toilet, which was quite a victory. The bathroom, being so frosty cold, helped a great deal. He shed his pack onto the tiled floor with a clunk from the gun. The cold air on his sweaty back helped too. All right. Hudson finally flushed for the last time. All right. He turned on the sink, He turned on the sink without thinking about the fact that this was the first working faucet he had encountered in years. Alright. And we'll say he splashed. Say he splashed instead of splashing. He splashed his face instead of washing his hands. Dirt ran dark into the sink. He used the flowery smelling soaps to wash himself more. Then he turned to the shower. Hudson stripped down and sat under the cold flow of water from the shower head. Let's make it a massaging shower head. From the massaging shower head for quite a while. A couple people knocked, but eventually gave up and went away. There were probably plenty of other bathrooms. He decided. He turned on the hot water for a couple minutes and realized he forgot how great hot showers were. After drying off, even putting on his cleanest clothes felt dirty to him. Okay, let's say he re-shouldered his pack and made his way through the house, got more cold water, bypassed the food, and sat down on a low stone wall outside as the wind off the lake blew through his wet hair. It felt good. It took his attention off his ailing stomach. It felt good. It took his attention off his ailing stomach. He watched the sunset over the water. And we'll say, let's mention the crowd again. Listening to the overlapping conversations all around him like geese. All right, there we go. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. Lily walked by as the darkness started to deepen, and she stopped. Hudson, I've been looking everywhere for you. I didn't mean to leave you fending for yourself so long on your first day. Did you go swimming? He looked out over the lake, and his breath caught in his throat as he saw lights coming on in other houses along the shore. They reflected in the darkening water, so beautiful. He felt tears sting his eyes. Hudson? He blinked several times and ran his hand through his wet, clean hair. No, I didn't swim. You changed clothes? I took a shower. He looked up at her like he expected to get in trouble. She smiled and leaned in to kiss his cheek. He started to turn his mouth toward her as she pulled away. Lily offered her hand instead, and he took it before she could, let's just say, change her mind. I don't know that that's exactly the way I want to say it, but I'm going to say it that way. Before she could change her mind. Okay. Moving along, Kent and Evan found some fireworks, she said. Mr. Hemingway said they could shoot them off away from the house. He could shoot them. Let me take the off away here so it's not too much. You could shoot them, comma, away from the house, comma, off the dock, comma, over the lake. There we go. Want to come? I'll go anywhere. Hudson stopped himself before he said, with you. It felt too dangerous. It felt too dangerous to say even. It felt too dangerous to say it all, even if it was true. I'll put a comma here and add a little more. Especially if it was true. All right. Maybe a little melodramatic, but I think it's okay for this story. Okay, she laughed and pulled him to his feet. He reached back and adjusted his pack as they marched down the grassy slope together. He didn't even think about his weapons as he did so. The darkness of night set in heavy as they reached the water. Kent, Evan, Sadie, and a couple others gathered on the dock as they set up the rockets in some sort of metal bucket. Others stood or sat along the shore, stretching out in both directions. You see a good spot for us? Lily asked. He stared at her a long moment. When her eyes narrowed, he looked quickly away. How about there? They walked over to a patch of grass under a large tree. Hudson shed his backpack again for the second time that day, counting his shower. Counting his, let's say, long bathroom visit. His long bathroom visit. Okay. Counting his long bathroom visit. All right. They settled in with their backs against the tree and their shoulders touching. Hudson breathed out slowly and a long sigh, and all his tensions and fears left him in that moment. All right. That sounded like it came from your soul, she said. I'd forgotten what it was like to be a person, what it was like to not be. When the pause felt too long to him, Lily saved him the awkward trouble, what it was like not to be alone. After she said it, his lips trembled. and he wiped his eyes on the back of one clean hand. Lily took his other hand in both of hers as she leaned against him and the tree. He looked up in the sky. Clouds. I hope it doesn't rain soon. It's too nice here for that. She looked up and shook her head. Sky is clear. He squinted. The stars, though. Let me put though here. That makes more sense. The stars, though. She smiled and reminded him lights make them harder to see sometimes. The fact was familiar to him and rose up from somewhere deep in his memory, from back before all the sickness and death started, back when he felt alive. The fireworks ripped up into the air in yellow-orange trails, brighter than the sun, against the settled darkness of starless night over the lake. Let's say they both startled together each and every time one ripped off. When they exploded overhead, the sparks spread out like the fronds of a burning palm tree. Hudson squeezed Lily's hands tighter, and she returned the pressure. He tasted something savory on his lips and coughed on something. And coughed out, say, whatever. Coughed out whatever it was. Hudson wiped his mouth and nose. In the artificial light all around him, he saw his hand covered in blood. He coughed again and brought up more of the stuff, clotted with loose tissue. His vision blurred as he blinked on bloody tears. Then he felt more of the stuff dripping out of one ear. He tried to get up, but lacked the energy as he choked on the stuff in his throat. Others all around him and Lily... Others all around him... Okay. Others all around Lily and him were cheering. I'm trying to keep this from being confusing so it doesn't sound like one of them is cheering. Alright, others all around Lily and him were cheering and shouting up at the exploding fireworks. His distress was lost in all that commotion. Hudson tried to pull his hand away from her grasp, but Lily had locked down on him and wasn't letting go. I shouldn't be here, he choked out the words from a thick, wet throat. I think I'm sick. Those were the scariest words from the last days of the world of people. She leaned heavy against him, and all he could say was, I'm so sorry. Lily started to fall forward. Her grip fell away from his hands. Hudson caught her and held her upright against his side. He put his arm around her and lifted her chin with his fingers. He was about to cry out for help, even if it meant others discovering what had happened to him. But in the next burst of gunpowder above their heads, he saw that she bled like a faucet from both of her nostrils. Her eyes rolled up to the whites that were now shock red from all the burst vessels, just like his mom. He hugged her close against his side as they leaned on that tree together. Her breathing slowed as the party went on into the night, and for a while they went unnoticed.